Wow! Wow, my hair looks crazy. I look like a madman. The lighting is so different because it's daytime. Proof I'm not a vampire. Or else I'm faking it, and that's actually not daylight. I'm just pumping in artificial light so as to trick vampire hunters. But no, I'm no vampire. I hate vampires. Trying to get the lighting. Well, I am lit. There is, in fact, light on my face. So that's probably good enough. Hey, hey, how, he, ha, who. Here's the YouTube comments question of the day so that I can get those precious, precious comments. Here's the comment of the day. Would you rather be alive or on a drive? Or here's another question. Here's another question. Would you rather have eyes or tell lies? And here's the third question. Would you rather be sad or mad or glad or just a tad bit drab? Those are all the questions. Answer them now. Did you get the answer typed up yet? Here's what they don't want you to know. Look at this. Looks like a normal old 8-ball, right? Well, here's what they don't want you to know. It's actually an infinity ball. That's why you have to get it in last. If you got it in before that, it would include everything else. It would include all the other balls. I'm telling you, people. Open your eyes! Okay. Well, this is just nobody. I don't know if anybody will actually join at this time in the live stream. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, I do live stream all of these on Twitch.com or Chat TV, whatever it is. It's Cold Stone Readery. I'm Cold Stone. I'm freezing. That's why I'm wearing this. And welcome to the Readery. A readery is a place where people read out loud. Today we'll be reading Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Hopefully, I got about almost 100 pages left. Doubt I'll finish it. Let's see. The afterwards an actual afterwards, or is it just? It's not. It's written by somebody else. So I won't be reading the afterwards. Hello to this one person. Let's see. There's 9 chapters left in Sense and Sensibility. A little less than. I'm so gobsmackingly hungover this morning. Well, world, be free. I agree, the world should be free for me to take. I'll rule over this world with an iron fist. Well, if you're hungover, enjoy some nice, relaxing story. Last time there's a Jane Austen word for you, gobsmackingly. I don't think she's ever said that. Maybe not in this book. She has not yet said that. But I have not read all the Jane Austen. I've only ever read what I've read of I've read Pride and Prejudice, and I have only read what I've read of Sense and Sensibility here. There'll be more Jane Austen to come. There'll be more. Well, world be free. Last time Edward Ferrars is getting married. Just read to me, man. I'm on the verge of throwing up. All right. Chapter 41. Edward, having carried his thanks to Colonel Brandon, Edward just got a job via Colonel Brandon. Proceeded with his happiness to Lucy, and such was the excess of it by time he reached Bartlett's Buildings that she was able to assure Mrs. Jennings, who called on her again the next day. Sorry. Do not disturb. That she was able to assure Mrs. Jennings, who called on her again the next day with her congratulations, that she had never seen him in such spirits before in her life. Her own happiness and her own spirits were at least very certain, and she joined Mrs. Jennings most heartily in her expectation of their being all comfortably together in Deltaford Parsonage before Michaelmas. So far was she, at the same time, from any backwardness to give Eleanor that credit which Edward would give her, that she spoke of her friendship for them both with the most grateful warmth, was ready to own all their obligation to her, and openly declared that no exertion for their good on Miss Dashwood's part, either present or future, would ever surprise her, for she believed her capable of doing anything in the world for those she really valued. As for Colonel Brandon, she was not only ready to worship him as a saint, but was moreover truly anxious that he should be treated as one in all worldly concerns, anxious that his tithes should be raised to the utmost, and secretly resolved to avail herself at Deltaford, as far as she possibly could, of his servants, his carriage, his cows, and his poultry. It was now above a week since John Dashwood had called in Berkeley Street, and as since that time no notice had been taken by them of his wife's indisposition beyond one verbal inquiry, Eleanor began to feel it necessary to pay her a visit. This was an obligation, however, which not only opposed her own inclination, but which had not the assistance of any encouragement from her companions. Marianne, not contented with absolutely refusing to go herself, was very urgent to prevent her sister's going at all, and Mrs. Jennings, though her carriage was always at Eleanor's service, so very much disliked Mrs. John Dashwood that not even her curiosity to see how she looked after the late discovery, nor her strong desire to affront her by taking Edward's part, could overcome her unwillingness to be in her company again. The consequence was that Eleanor set out by herself to pay a visit for which no one could really have less inclination, and to run the risk of a tete-a-tete with a woman whom neither of the others had so much reason to dislike. Mrs. Dashwood was denied, but before the carriage could turn from the house, her husband accidentally came out. He expressed great pleasure in meeting Eleanor, told her that he had been just going to call in Berkeley Street, and assured her that Fanny would be very glad to see her, invited her to come in. They walked upstairs into the drawing room. Nobody was there. Fanny is in her own room, I suppose, said he. I will go get her presently, for I am sure she will not have the least objection in the world to seeing you. Very far from it indeed. Now, especially, there could not be. But, however, you and Marianne were always great favourites. Why would not Marianne come? Eleanor made what excuse she could for her. I'm sorry to see you alone, he replied, for I have a good deal to say to you. This living of Colonel Brandon's, can it be true? Has he really given it to Edward? I heard it yesterday by chance, and was coming to you on purpose to inquire further about it. It's perfectly true. Colonel Brandon has given the living of Deltaford to Edward. Really? Well, this is very astonishing. No relationship, no connection between them, and now that livings fetch such a price. What was the value of this? About 200 a year. Very well. And for the next presentation to a living of that value, supposing that late incumbent to have been old and sickly, and likely to vacate it soon, he might have got it, dare I say, £1,400. And how came he not to have settled that matter before this person's death? Now, indeed, it would be too late to sell it, but a man of Colonel Brandon's sense, hmm, I wonder he should be so improvident to, uh, improvident, in a point of such common, such natural concern. Well, I am convinced that there is a vast deal of inconsistency in almost every human character. I suppose, however, on recollection, that the case may probably be this. Edward is only to hold the living till the person to whom the colonel has really sold the presentation is old enough to take it. Aye, aye, that is the fact. Depend on it. World Be Free says, dude, I doubt these books pass the Bechdel test. I doubt even these books. You're probably right. I can't remember a conversation. They might have talked about the house at some point, but it is usually about romance. It's about the guy. But to be fair, the guy, yeah, no, two female characters talking about something, two named female characters talking about something that isn't a man. A man and a woman had a long conversation about money at the beginning, Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood. Um, but yeah, I think you're right. I seriously doubt it. I can't remember. I'll keep an eye out for it. I usually don't read things with that in mind because I don't care. But man, this lighting is hard to get right. I'm so cast in shadow. Whatever. I think you're probably right. Eleanor contradicted it, however, very positively, and by relating that she had herself been employed in conveying the offer from Colonel Brandon to Edward, and therefore must understand the terms on which it was given, obliged him to submit to her authority. It is truly astonishing, he cried after hearing what she said. What could be the Colonel's motive? A very simple one, to be of use to Mr. Ferrars. Well, well, whatever Colonel Brandon may be, Edward is a very lucky man. You will not mention the matter to Fanny, however, for though I have broke it to her, and she bears it vastly well, she will not like to hear it much talked of. Eleanor had some difficulty here to refrain from observing that she thought Fanny might have borne with composure an acquisition of wealth to her brother, by which neither she nor her child could be possibly impoverished. Mrs. Ferrars, added he, lowering his voice to the tone becoming so important a subject, knows nothing about it at present, and I believe it will be best to keep it entirely concealed from her as long as may be. When the marriage takes place, I fear she must hear of it all. But why should such a precaution be used, though it is not to be supposed that Mrs. Ferrars could have the smallest satisfaction in knowing that her son has money enough to live upon? For that must be quite out of the question. Yet why, after her late behaviour, is she supposed to feel it all? She has done with her son, she has cast him off forever, and has made all those over whom she had any influence cast him off likewise. Surely, after doing so, she cannot be imagined liable to any impression of sorrow or of joy on his account. She cannot be interested in anything that befalls him. She would not be so weak as to throw away the comfort of a child and yet retain the anxiety of a parent. Ah, Eleanor, said John, your reasoning is very good, but it is founded on ignorance of human nature. When Edward's unhappy match takes place, depend upon it his mother will feel as much as if she had never discarded him. What the heck? Get out of there, cat. Sorry, my cat just decided to eat paper. Sorry for the interruption. Um, When Edward's unhappy match takes place, depend upon it his mother will feel as much as if she had never discarded him, and therefore every circumstance that may accelerate that dreadful event must be concealed from her as much as possible. Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son. You surprise me. I should think it must nearly have escaped her memory by this time. You wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferrars is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world. Eleanor was silent. We think now, said Mr. Dashwood after a short pause, of Robert's marrying Miss Morton. This is helping out, but my phone is at 4%. I don't know if I make it to an outlet in my feeble state. I believe in you. Not for my own sake, but for yours, just to show that you have strength within you, unlimited, if you're willing to tap it. Your willpower is the only limit of your strength. World be free. Um, Also because I want you to keep listening to me. Uh, Care to chat about books, or you want to keep reading? Oh, I'm always down for a chat. What do you want to talk about, World Be Free? This is a reading and discussion. There's no limit to how much discussion. Oops. I accidentally just opened up something else on my. I accidentally just opened up a Firefox tab. Well, I just started reading books again, and I figured out what I like. What do you like, World Be Free? I personally am into the classics. Let's see. um, That's a good thing I'm into the classics because it's basically all I can read on here. I like survival stories, nonfiction mostly, but even fiction. Survival stories. I um, I recommend, and I've done a reading of this. I'm not just trying to shill my own stuff. It's on my YouTube, just in case you want to know. But for either way, you should read Jack London for fiction. Uh, how to light a fire, the short story. Touching the Void, Alive, Once the Martian, 127 Hours. I've not read any of those books. Um, to Build a Fire by Jack London is a great, horrible short story. I really can't even call it a survival story, not to spoil anything. Uh, but it is certainly about a situation in which somebody is trying to survive. To light a fire, building a fire. That's what it is. Building a fire by Jack London. Into the Wild. I have done a reading of that too. It's not. I mean, people are surviving within it, but it's mostly kind of just about like a harsh business, like the business of the transporting through the wilds up north. I mean, the only characters that are like bad enough at it that you consider them in like a survival situation are only Jack. Yeah, seventh grade. Yeah, it's still good to this day. It holds up. Well, it holds up at an older age, I should say. Um, but yeah, Into the Wild. Wait a second. Into the Wild. Oh yeah, the McCandless story. Um, Chris McCandless. Yeah, I read that one in I think like ninth grade or something. That one's not bad. Dude at Into the Wild talks about Jack London a lot. Yeah. Yeah, he does. Into the Wild I remember being good. It's a good like I'm reading that now. Yeah, it is certainly good. It's a good like warning story about like if you're gonna go off and try to survive, you gotta you gotta know what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just gonna walk into the woods and die. Um, it's a whole nother world out there. You have to know it. Can't live without knowledge. human beings, we take care of ourselves more than we think of. We take care of each other more than we think of it. Like fucking. Oh, I just swore. Whoops. Like society. I didn't swear. Bleep that. It's a family show for me, on my end at least. Um, yeah, Into the Wild is pretty good. I'm big into John Krakauer. He's probably my favorite. Have you read his other stuff like In Thin Air or whatever it's called? I have not read anything else by Krakauer. If you have Krakauer, if you have, let me know how they compare to Into the Wild because I liked Into the Wild back in the day. That was certainly one of my favorite things we had to read in school. Um, just because what teenage boy, even a man really, what man doesn't envision himself pulling a Chris McCandless and just going and saying, "Oh, I don't need this. I don't need a stable job or a stable living situation. I'm just going off into the woods. I'm just gonna go live in the woods." I think everybody imagines that when they're young, at least. Yep, Thin Air, Under the Banner of Heaven, Where Men Win Glory. Um, I have not read anything else by Krakauer. If they're good, let me know because I'll read them. I do own Into Thin Air. Oh, what are you doing, kitty? I do own Into Thin Air. Never actually picked it up to read it though. Um, Another survival book that's fiction that's where Wind and Glory is about Pat Tillman, the NFL player who went to Afghanistan and got killed. Oh, yeah, I know that a lot of the only thing I know about Pat Tillman is that I think he was the guy who just got really, really started mouthing off again. Mouthing off it sounds discriminatory, but whatever. I'm not trying to put the guy down. He started talking a lot of trash about the U.S. military, and then didn't he just get like shot in the back or something? And they said, "Oh, yeah, we don't know what happened," and the military still uses him as like propaganda. Join the military, like this hero Pat Tillman, even though he hated the military by the end. That's the only thing I think I know about Pat Tillman. I'm really completely ignorant on the subject, and I could be completely talking about something else. Killed by friendly fire, yeah. Okay, I thought so. Yeah, I know that his. I think that it's what I heard is that his family hates that. Yeah, he was anti-war in Afghanistan. His family hates that the military still uses him as propaganda to try to get young kids to join the military, even though he was completely against that by the end of his life. Very, very sad. I have to read that. That's too interesting. Is Krakauer actually? He totally didn't want anything to propaganda when he was. Yeah. Is Krakauer's reporting of it fair and balanced? Is it actually well researched? Because that story does interest me quite a bit. I'll have to find a copy of that to read at some point. Because because yeah, I like that quite a bit. I mean, anti-war stuff is usually up my alley. I would say so. He doesn't get too conspiratorial. Okay. Yeah, some people jump to conspiracy conclusions too quickly, but I mean it's a complicated world out there. A lot of stuff can happen, but I just hate things when people say things without. I hate it when people report things falsely or don't do enough research and report things by accident. Really, a big pet peeve of mine is misinformation. I hate misinformation so much. Pat Tillman sounded like a great man. From what I've heard, I agree, but like I said, I'm fairly ignorant on the subject. Um, One fictional book. I'm trying to think of survival books. Well, obviously for younger readers, Hatchet. I remember reading that in like elementary school. Um, Hatchet was great. Maybe pick that one up if you haven't read it. That one freaked me out as a kid. There's a scene where a corpse is being eaten by fish. And he goes down and looks at the fish eating corpse. I don't know, very freaky. And like, with the fourth or fifth grade, whenever we read that, the movie had the face of the guy. That freaked me out as a kid. Um, John Krakauer also talks about the gaffes of the early days of the invasion of Afghanistan since Iraq. The military seemingly had no idea what they were doing. Yeah. Um, there's another book about that called Redeployment by, I think it was Philip Clay. It was Clay, it was the last name, I think. Redeployment is the name of the book. And it's all about that. It's sort of like, if you've ever read The Things They Carried, like short stories from a Vietnam veteran's perspective. Well, redeployment is sort of short stories from an Afghanistan soldier's, not an American in Afghanistan's perspective, written by a veteran, obviously, and it's pretty good. I don't think it's quite as good as Things They Carried. I've read that one more than I've read Redeployment, though, so I don't know if I'm just biased, but I recommend Redeployment for a similar sort of Afghanistan story. I want to say it was Afghanistan. I read it like 6 years ago, so I it was either Afghanistan or Iraq, but I'm pretty sure it was Afghanistan. Fairly good book. Um, I also just watched American Sniper. Dude was literally the exact opposite of Pat Tillman. So loved the U.S. military, wanted people to join up with it, and killed. What would be the opposite of? I guess dying by the enemy or just living would be the opposite. I don't know. I never watched American Sniper. I don't watch a lot of war movies, but if it's good, I'll give it a shot at some point. Um, I don't like I don't like movies that like glorify war. I guess it's fine. Like I'm not like totally disgusted by it or whatever, but I guess they both died of friendly fire. But yeah, good point. Uh, Dying of friendly fire, that really sucks. Um, to me, if the Pat Tillman story was told to high school students, we probably would the dropping military enlistment numbers would drop to like zero. If it just, oh yeah, don't talk out or else somebody will put a bullet in your back. Sorry to sound like some hothead or jock, but I do like survival stories. I don't think you sound like a hothead or jock. Um, Fictional, very like almost fantastical, science fictional survival story is if you're not frickin'. I keep almost swearing. I gotta not swear. This is a family show. I'm a family figure. Um, 2001 and the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah, 2001 is surprisingly good as a book. The movie's obviously a masterpiece, but the book is also like really entertaining. And Cuckoo's Nest is, I have not actually seen the movie of Cuckoo's Nest, but yeah, the book is of just like a psychedelic romp. It's awesome. Obviously, it's kind of sad, but I still remember like most of the funny scenes from it, like when they all go break out to go fishing. I have not seen the movie. Cuckoo's Egg. What the heck is a cuckoo's egg? I've only read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. What the heck is cuckoo's egg? I haven't seen Cuckoo's Nest actually. I have not seen the movie either, but I've read the book. Um, the book is good, but it is kind of a survival story. Survival in a situation of mental survival rather than like physical survival. You're being drugged, and the nurses are they. If people think you're insane and treat you like you're insane, even though you're not, it's a scary situation. It's like a cyber hacking story in the early days of the internet. That sounds interesting. Is it a? It's nonfiction. Cyber hacking in the early days of the internet. I'm trying to think of any stories I know like that, like real life stuff I've heard reported on. I don't really look. I mostly read non-fictional stuff. If I read, or I mostly read fictional stuff. If I read any non-fiction, usually it's more historical. Like I love Bronze Age history and early civilization and pre-civilization history. But I have not read much of like modern day history or anything like that. So I definitely have to give Cuckoo's Egg a look at too. I'm gonna write these down. These are good recommendations. Um, there's Cuckoo's Egg, and what was the other one? Where men win glory. Bronze Age. I'm not sure if it's technically Bronze Age or Classical Age, but for like first, what's it? First hand accounts, first, yeah, first hand, whatever. I don't know what the word I'm trying to think of is, but for actual historical, good news. I made it to an outlet. Good. I'm glad your phone is not dead. Rest in peace, your phone. Long live your phone. For good book recommendations, I recommend for an actual ancient source, I'd recommend Herodotus as like a good starting point for ancient history. Now, Herodotus of Herodotus is not like don't read him thinking like, wow, look at this 100% historically accurate guy. He says he went around and traveled all these places and he's just reporting on what he saw. But like he walked into like battlefields and like poked things with a stick. Like he was not doing like surveys and anything proper to figure out the information. He just heard like rumors and then wrote them down pretty much. But he's a very interesting and funny guy from like 400 BC or something. Like really old stuff, but you can still just he just drips with character in his descriptions of all these things that he's seen and heard about. He's like my favorite historical writer that I've read so far. I don't know if he's technically Bronze Age. I don't know where that cuts off. He was a Greek. Halicarnassus is where he's from. Um, but yeah, Herodotus. His histories is what it histories of Herodotus. That'd be my recommendation. Um, I know that Tom Holland is pretty famous for his translation of that. Well, it's enthralling to think about traveling back in those days. Looks like he was born in Turkey but spent time in Greece and Italy, modern day. Yeah, Halicarnassus is in Turkey. Now I think about it, you're right. What is it, Halicarnassus? I can't remember how to pronounce it. Like, did they pack snacks for the road back then? Yeah, I think he must have had provisions. It was like multiple days or weeks of traveling, so he definitely had to have food. Um, yeah, it is. It is definitely. That's why he had to report it all because you couldn't just go and watch it on TV like he was how you learned about ancient stuff. Somebody who just went there or was from there just had to tell you. It's really This really is the age of information we live in now. We haven't perfected it, but information now is so much easier than it was back then, where it was, I'm going to dedicate my life to going off and finding information about this place and writing it down and reporting it to people. I wonder if they felt closer to their homeland back then. I bet you their homeland felt like a, yeah, I mean, it was probably more like an actual. Yeah, I think they probably did because their homeland was everybody they knew. Like they might not have liked everybody, but if you live around people and see them every day, you kind of have to at least like them a little. You have to be able to tolerate them. Like when they traveled, did they still miss being home? Um, I'm sure not a lot of. I don't think as many people. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I'm sure some people. I can't. I'm trying to think of homesickness being reported in ancient writings. I don't think that uh, Herodotus ever said that he was homesick when he was traveling, but I'm sure that it comes up at some point. I've never thought about it. If I ever find an example of homesickness in ancient writings, I'll definitely keep that in mind now. I've never thought about it. I'm sure they did because it would have been so much easier to exist in your home, excuse me, in your homeland than it would have been on the road where you have to buy, hide. Like it's dangerous to travel. There's thieves all over the place. It's not like there was I mean if you're in an empire's land, there might be you might have some protection like in towns, but on the road nowadays for some people it seems like the most comfortable place is their home. But did that happen back then? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's like a universal human thing that's like happened since it's sort of like if you I don't know if you the 2001 you mentioned was 2001 a Space Odyssey, but in the beginning of that book there's a it sort of describes the ancient people, you know, the ancient pre-humans or whatever, as finding their caves. Yeah. Remember the beginning of that book how they had to make it in their caves and they treated it like it was sort of like how we treat houses? I think that that's not an inaccurate interpretation of human beings at the time. I think that's probably what it was like, personally. That you would find these little safe spots that you made safe or that were safe naturally, and you would cling to them and live there. That's why they would like paint things in there and stuff and kind of make it their own because it was their place, it was their home. And they would, you know, you try to get back to it every night so that you know you're in a safe enough spot. Obviously, you're never 100% safe in even now, but back then for sure. Nobody's ever 100% safe. In fact, you're always in danger. A meteor could strike me right now, and I wouldn't never see it coming. Or more realistically, a truck or something could come through my wall. There's a tangent though. Um, yeah, a good. I kept trying to say this, but fictional book, survival, like sort of fantasy, and it might seem kind of stupid, but I seriously think World War Z is like the best, one of the best zombie things I've ever seen or read. The book, not the movie. World War Z, the book, is very very good zombie media. Be curious to know about what these people like Herodotus thinks of the modern world. There's some YouTube channels that do that are historians think that I think Told in Stone is one of them. Not in a bad way, just to get their thoughts. I know that I always get recommended on YouTube videos like, "What would Romans think of New York?" or What would ancient Greeks think of America?" Stuff like that. Told in Stone, I think, is one of the, and he's not me. Just he stole my name, Stone. Yeah, Told in Stone is a good one. I'm trying to think of the other one I just saw. Yeah, oh heck yeah, come on, keep it family friendly here. Um, Not that I'm ever going to censor the chat, as little as I can help it. I hate censoring people. I just saw one on my YouTube recommendations, or I hope it was my subscriptions. I'm going through, um, but I don't see it. Must have been in recommendations. Oh yeah, Told in Stone footnotes just released one. What would a Roman think of New York? Um, on his second channel. So if you already watched Told in Stone, go check out his second channel to find out what he thinks that ancient Romans would think of New York. There's a bunch of videos like that that I always get recommended. That's like what people always think, and it's definitely a good thought to be like. But I mean, I wonder what we would think about the future. I feel like people nowadays never think about the future as like a real thing that's going to exist. Well, not even really nowadays. Apocalyptic thinking has always been a thing. What would an ancient Roman die instantly if dropped off in Times Square? I have heard it said that given like a big enough span of time, like shock would just kill you if you just traveled through time. I don't. That was probably from like game theorists or some stupid like. I don't think it was like a super scientific study that I found that in, but I've definitely heard it said that there's like a thing, a span of time where if you traveled forward from this time to this, and it's constantly shrinking. So like if you put a Napoleonic soldier into like 100 years later, like World War I, they probably wouldn't just die of shock. But put them into like 2023, and they might. Those funny memes of the songs that would instantly kill King Phillips. Yeah. I think if you dropped like a caveman into Times Square, they would probably die of shock because they would just think, "Oh, I'm in heaven." They'd probably think they're in some sort of afterlife or something. Like they were transported to the underworld or something. Everything is bright and noisy, and there's all these loud metal creatures just roaring. I guess they don't go that fast in New York, but uh, there's these loud metal creatures that just honking, and people are coming in and out of them. And hey, if you raised a baby born 10,000 years ago, they would be do just fine. Well, yeah. It's not like it's all upbringing pretty much. Human beings are basically just like getting used to it machines. We just like get used to everything. You just put us in a situation and we get used to it. Especially babies, they get used to things so bam, they're used to it. Um, you just treat them the same way a couple of times, and that's what they think all of life is. Um, and even adults can get used to things pretty quick. If you raise somebody to do anything, you can get them to do anything. Getting used to it, machines. Yeah, that's pretty much what we are. We just get used to things. That's why you can manipulate us so easily. We're basically sure we can survive under pretty much any economic system or any system of leadership, just so long as you don't like bother us. We're probably not even going to overthrow you. As long as you just like let us get you don't if things don't go too quickly, so we can't get used to things. We have to be able to get used to it. There's some theory that people have a baseline of happiness despite their situation. Yeah, we get used to it. We get used to it pretty much. Uh, as long as you don't hit us with too many changes right in a row. Yeah. Well, yeah. Whether you win the lottery or get paralyzed. Yeah. You buy a new car and you think, oh, this thing is so great. It's so wonderful. And you look at it and you just get a little bit of happy every time you see it in the parking lot. And then a little bit less happy every time you see it until it's just your car. And then you don't think about it ever again. I think it's pretty much like that for everything in life. You just get used to your life as it is and it just becomes mundane. And you have to kind of be shook out of that mundanity to like look at the world in a wonderful way again. It's certainly hard to hold on to that wonder for life that still exists within you, even as an adult. Everybody still has that wonder within them, I think. At least I do. Life is absolutely amazing. If you let yourself enjoy it and don't just get sucked into the trap of mundanity and just thinking, well, this is my life, this is how I exist. Just don't let mundanity drag you down. You can find some wonder in it, especially if you read books. I think that certainly helps. I think reading books opens up your eyes to wonder a bit more. Romantic poetry and stuff like that will help. But just anything that like gives you an idea of how other people think and how they're living their lives in completely different ways, but are similar but different. It's really wonderful. A fun way to get out of the mundanity is go to a new gas station you've been to before and grab like a soda you've never had. Yeah, trying new things, even if it's not buying products, because I personally don't like to buy products, but um, that is certainly one way to do it. Just going to a new place. There's plenty of parks around most places, even suburbs and cities. Just go to a new park or a new forest and check things out. Um, Talk to new people. That helps. Throw yourself out of your comfort situation. Pretty anti-consumer as well. Uh, yeah, I just think that I don't like everything being turned into a market and just the fact that people will unironically say, I have consumed products, or I have consumed content today. I consumed this much content today. When people say that, I'm like, I mean, I'm not going to censor them and say don't say that, but it's even. I'm just saying it's slipping into our language. We're just thinking of ourselves as consuming machines. Um, it's slipping into our language. It's slipping into our thought process, and art is turning into content and uh, enjoyment or appreciation, experience, whatever you want to call it, is turning into consumption. I appreciate the thing you do here, just reading to people. Some people need people to read to them. Not everybody has a parent that can tell them a bedtime story. That's what I'm here for. Even if you don't have, even if you don't, it's a cool thing to do. Yeah, it's pretty niche. I don't expect it to ever get too popular, which is fine by me because who wants to be famous, and especially who wants to be internet famous. But it is fun for me, so that's why I will continue to do it, no matter how. Even if it's just to you, just to one person. That's what I do. I don't. I don't need it to be to millions to continue. Um, it's honestly mostly just for like my mom and my aunt. They're like my most consistent viewers. But I gotta say, Jane Austen was not doing it for me. Well, that's fine. Everybody has their own taste. I can't please everybody with my choices. Um, but I like this story. I like Jane Austen. I think Sense and Sensibility here is pretty funny. Um, she's like pretty consistently makes me laugh as I'm reading it, which is certainly not true of most books. I mean, there are funny books out there. Um, there are certainly books that make me laugh, but books are not the best way to get your laughs. Sorry to say. I mean, some of them are. There's some jokes that can only be told in books. So, comedy is certainly transcends the medium that it exists within, but I guess I have to look more for the humor. It's a comedy. If you think of it as like a romance, like you're trying to really get into the romance and see who gets with who. Personally, that part doesn't appeal to me that much. I think it's pretty, boilerplate standard like romantic triangle. What do they call it? Romance triangle. What's it called? Love triangle. It's a pretty like boilerplate standard story. I mean, it's I don't know how common it was at the time, but like girl gets dumped, gets sad, girl likes guy, guy likes other girl, first girl gets sad. I don't know what's lighting is better. It's not like the most fantastical thing in the world on the plot, but just the like witty, sort of sarcastic way she delivers the story is very funny to me. Like when she says John Dash, like today, John Dashwood accidentally walked outside. Just that accidentally in there to show that he was avoiding them, but he didn't realize they were still there. It's just such like it's just full of small little human moments like that where the humor is on things that are universal enough, making fun of things that are universally human enough. Oh yeah. I appreciate our conversation. You're an interesting guy, but I'm about to fall back asleep and want to get rid of this hangover. Maybe I'll check you again outside. My name is John. I live in Colorado. Well, John, glad to meet you. Glad you're following. Get some sleep. Drink some water before you go to sleep. Um, drink more. Drink like a big cup of water before you go to sleep. That'll certainly help. Um, Glad to meet you, World Be Free. Hope to see you more. Um, Good water tip, yeah. Drink the water. That's great for hangovers. If you have anything with electrolytes, that's hangover juice. Water chugging contest. Do it. If I had, I really should have water here, but I don't. I would chug with you. World be free. I guess I'll just have to chug this cat medicine. Mmm, tasty. Well, world be free. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm gonna keep reading Sense and Sensibility after you're gone. Thanks for the follow. Check me out on YouTube for the old stuff if you want to see me read Jack London. Uh, Same name, Coldstone Raidery on YouTube. Just shilling my stuff shamelessly to you. Do it or don't. It doesn't. It's up to you. It's your life. Um, Enjoy the read. Have a good day, John. Or should I say, world be free? So I don't send. So I don't. All right. I'm gonna keep reading the no one then, because that's just the kind of guy I am. Enjoy your life. World be free. Now where was I? Decent butt crease. Um, where was I? Eleanor, said John, your reasoning is very good, but it is founded on ignorance of human nature. When Edward's unhappy match takes place, depend upon his mother will feel as much as if she had never discarded him, and therefore every circumstance that may accelerate that dreadful event must be concealed from her as much as possible. Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son. You surprise me. I should think I must nearly have escaped her memory by this time. You wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferris is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world. Eleanor was silent. Funny. We think now, said Mr. John Dashwood after a short pause, of Robert's marrying Miss Morton. Eleanor, smiling at the grave and decisive importance of her brother's tone, calmly replied, the lady, I suppose, has no choice in the affair. Choice? How do you mean? I only mean that I suppose from your manner of speaking it must be the same to Miss Morton, whether she marry Edward or Robert. Certainly there can be no difference, for Robert will now to all intents and purposes be considered as the eldest son, and as to anything else, they are both very agreeable young men. I do not know that one is superior to the other. Eleanor said no more, and John was also for a short time silent. His reflections ended thus: of one thing, my dear sister, kindly taking her hand and speaking in an awful whisper, I may assure you, and I will do it because I know it must gratify you. I have good reason to think, indeed I have it from the best authority, or I should not repeat it, for otherwise it would be very wrong to say anything about it, but I have it from the very best authority. Not that I ever precisely heard Mrs. Ferris say it herself, but her daughter did, and I have it from her, that, in short, whether objections there might be against a certain connection, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her. It would not have given her half the vexation that this does. I was exceedingly pleased to hear that Mrs. Ferris considered it in that light, a very gratifying circumstance, you know, to us all. It would have been beyond comparison, she said, the least evil of the two. But she would be glad to compound now for nothing worse. But, however, all that is quite out of the question, now to be thought of or mentioned, as to any attachment, you know, it never could be, all that is gone by. But I thought I would just tell you of this now, tell you of this because I knew how much it must please you. Now that you have any not that you have any reason to regret, my dear Eleanor. There is no doubt of your doing exceedingly well, quite as well, or better, perhaps, all things considered. Has Colonel Brandon been with you lately? Eleanor had heard enough, if not to gratify her vanity and raise her self-importance, to agitate her nerves and fill her mind. She was therefore glad to be spared from the necessity of saying much in reply herself, and from the danger of hearing anything more from her brother by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrars. After a few moments' chat, John Dashwood, recollecting that Fanny was yet uninformed of her sister's being there, quitted the room in quest of her, and Elinor was left to improve her acquaintance with Robert, who, by the gay unconcern, the happy self-complacency of his manner, while enjoying so unfair a division of his mother's love and liberality, the prejudice of his banished brother, earned only by his own dissipate course of life and that brother's integrity, was confirming her most unfavorable opinion of his head and heart. They had scarcely been 2 minutes by themselves before he began to speak of Edward, for he too had heard of the living, and was very inquisitive on the subject. Elinor repeated the particulars of it as she had given them to John, and their effect on Robert, though very different, was not less striking than it had been on him. He laughed most immoderately. The idea of Edward's being a clergyman and living in a small parsonage house diverted him beyond measure, and when to that was added the fanciful imagery of Edward reading prayers in a white surplice, and publishing the bonds of marriage between John Smith and Mary Brown, he could conceive nothing more ridiculous. Elinor, while she waited in silence and immovable gravity the conclusion of such folly, could not restrain her eyes from being fixed on him with a look that spoke all the contempt it excited. It was a look, however, very well bestowed, for it relieved her own feelings and gave no intelligence to him. He was recalled from wit to wisdom, not by any reproof of hers, but by his own sensibility. Sense and sensibility. "We may treat it as a joke," said he at last, recovering from the affected laugh which had considerably lengthened out the genuine gaiety of the moment. "But upon my soul, it is a most serious business. Poor Edward! He is ruined for ever. I am extremely sorry for it, for I know him to be a very good-hearted creature, as well-meaning a fellow, perhaps, as any in the world. You must not judge him. You must not judge of him, Miss Dashwood, from your slight acquaintance. Poor Edward! His manners are certainly not the happiest in nature. But we are not all born, you know, with the same powers, the same address. Poor fellow! To see him in a circle of strangers, to be sure it was pitiable enough, but upon my soul I believe he has as good a heart as any in the kingdom, and I declare to protest to you I never was so shocked in my life as when it all burst forth. I could not believe it. My mother was the first person who told me of it, and I, feeling myself called on to act with resolution, immediately said to her, 'My dear madam, I do not know what you may intend to do on this occasion, but as for myself, I must say that if Edward does marry this young woman, I never will see him again.' That was what I said immediately. I was most uncommonly shocked indeed. Poor Edward! He has done for himself completely, shut himself out forever from all decent society. But as I directly said to my mother, I am not in the least surprised at it. From his style of education it was always to be expected. My poor mother was half frantic." "Have you ever seen the lady?" "Yes, once while she was staying in this house. I happened to drop in for 10 minutes, and I saw quite enough of her. The merest awkward country girl, without style or elegance, and almost without beauty. I remember her perfectly. Just the kind of girl I should suppose likely to captivate poor Edward. I offered immediately, as soon as my mother related the affair to me, to talk to him myself and dissuade him from the match, but it was too late then. I found to do anything. For unluckily I was not in the way at first, and knew nothing of it till after the breach had taken place, when it was not for me, you know, to interfere. But had I been informed of it, but now it is all too late. He must be starved, you know. That is certain, absolutely starved. He had just settled this point with great composure when the entrance of Mrs. John Dashwood put an end to the subject. But though she never spoke of it of her own family, Eleanor could see its influence on her mind in the something like confusion of countenance with which she entered, and an attempted cordiality in her behaviour to herself. She even proceeded so far as to be concerned to find that Eleanor and her sister were so soon to leave town, as she had hoped to see more of them, an exertion in which her husband, who attended her into the room and hung enamoured over her accents, seemed to distinguish everything that was most affectionate and graceful. End of chapter 41. On to chapter 42. One other short call in Harley Street, in which Eleanor received her brother's congratulations on their travelling so far towards Barton without any expense on the Colonel Brandon's being to follow them to Cleveland. Excuse me. One other short call in Harley Street, in which Eleanor received her brother's congratulations on their travelling so far towards Barton without any expense, and on Colonel Brandon's being to follow them to Cleveland in a day or two, completed the intercourse of the brother and sisters in town, and a faint invitation from Fanny to come to Norland whenever it should happen to be in their way, which of all things was the most unlikely to occur, with a more warm, though less public, assurance from John to Eleanor of the promptitude with which he should come to see her at Deltaford, was all that foretold any meeting in the country. It amused her to observe that all her friends seemed determined to send her to Deltaford, place which, of all others, she would now least choose to visit or wish to reside, for not only was it considered as her future home by her brother and Mrs. Jennings, but even Lucy, when they parted, gave her a pressing invitation to visit her there. Very early in April, and tolerable early in the day, the two parties from Hanover Square and Berkeley Street set out from their respective homes to meet by appointment on the road. For the convenience of Charlotte and her child, they were to be more than 2 days on their journey, and Mr. Palmer, travelling more expeditiously with Colonel Brandon, was to join them at Cleveland soon after their arrival. Marianne, few as had been her hours of comfort in London, and eager as she had long been to quit it, could not, when it came to the point, bid adieu to the house in which she had for the last time enjoyed those hopes and that confidence in Willoughby which were now extinguished for ever, without great pain. Nor could she leave the place in which Willoughby remained, busy in new engagements and new schemes in which she could have no share, without shedding many tears. Eleanor's satisfaction at the moment of removal was more positive. She had no such object for her lingering thoughts to fix on. She left no creature behind from whom it would give her a moment's regret to be divided forever. She was pleased to be free herself from the persecution of Lucy's friendship. She was grateful for bringing her sister away unseen by Willoughby since his marriage, and she looked forward with hope to what a few months of tranquillity at Barton might do towards restoring Marianne's peace of mind and confirming her own. Their journey was safely performed. The second day brought them into the cherished, or the prohibited, county of Somerset, for as such was it dwelt on by turns in Marianne's imagination, and in the forenoon of the third day they drove up to Cleveland. Cleveland was a spacious, modern built house situated on a sloping lawn. It had no park, but the pleasure grounds were tolerably extensive, and like every other place of the same degree of importance, it had its open shrubbery and closer wood walk. A road of smooth gravel winding round a plantation led to the front. The lawn was dotted over with timber. The house itself was under the guardianship of the fir, the mountain ash, and the acacia, and a thick screen of them altogether, interspersed with tall Lombardy poplars, shut out the offices. Marianne entered the house with a heart swelling with emotion from the consciousness of being only 80 miles from Barton, and not 30 from Combe Magna, and before she had been 5 minutes within its walls, while the others were busy helping Charlotte show her child to the housekeeper, she quitted it again, stealing away through the winding shrubberies, now just beginning to be in beauty, to gain a distant eminence where, from its Grecian temple, her eyes wandered, wandering over a wide tract of country to the southeast, could fondly rest on the farthest ridge of hills in the horizon, and fancy that from their summits Combe Magna might be seen. In such moments of precious, of invaluable misery, she rejoiced she rejoiced in tears of agony to be at Cleveland, and as she returned by a different circuit to the house, feeling all the happy privilege of country liberty, wandering from place to place in free and luxurious solitude, she resolved to spend almost every hour of every day while she remained with the Palmers in the indulgence of such solitary rambles. She returned just in time to join the others as they quitted the house on an excursion through its more immediate uh, premises, and the rest of the morning was easily whiled away in lounging round the kitchen garden, examining the bloom upon its walls, and listening to the gardener's lamentations upon blights in dawdling through the greenhouse, where the loss of her favorite plants, warily exposed and nipped by the lingering frost, raised the laughter of Charlotte, and in visiting her poultry yard, where, in the disappointed hopes of her dairymaid, by hens forsaking their nests, or being stolen by a fox, or in the rapid decease of a promising young brood, she found fresh sources of merriment. The morning was fine and dry, and Marianne, in her plan of employment abroad, had not calculated for any change of weather during their stay at Cleveland. With great surprise, therefore, did she find herself prevented by a settled rain from going out again after dinner. She had depended on a twilight walk to the Grecian temple, and perhaps all over the grounds, and an evening merrily cold or damp would not have deterred her from it, but a heavy and settled rain even she could not fancy dry or pleasant weather for walking. Their party was small, and the hours passed quietly away. Mrs. Palmer had her child, and Mrs. Jennings her carpet work. They talked of the friends they had left behind, arranged Lady Middleton's engagements, and wondered whether Mr. Palmer and Colonel Brandon would get farther than reading that night. Reading. Eleanor, however, little concerned in it, joined in their discourse, and Marianne, who had the knack of finding her way in every house to the library, however it might be avoided by the family in general, soon a book. Procured, per, procured herself a book. Nothing was wanting on Mrs. Palmer's side that constant and friendly good humor could do to make them feel. Phew, nothing was wanting on Mrs. Palmer's side that constant and friendly good humor could do to make them feel themselves welcome. The openness and heartiness of her manner more than atoned for that want of recollection and elegance which made her often deficient in the forms of politeness. Her kindness, recommended by so pretty a face, was engaged. Her folly, though evident, was not disgusting because it was not conceited, and Eleanor could have forgiven everything but her laugh. The two gentlemen arrived the next day to a very late dinner, affording a pleasant enlargement of the party and a very welcome variety to their conversation, which a long morning of the same continued rain had reduced very low. Eleanor had seen so little of Mr. Palmer, and in that little had seen so much variety in his address to her sister and herself, that she knew not what to expect to find him in his own family. She found him, however, perfectly the gentleman in his behaviour to all his visitors, and only occasionally rude to his wife and her mother. She found him very capable of being a pleasant companion, and only prevented from being so always by too great an aptitude to fancy himself as much superior to people in general as he must feel himself to be to Mrs. Jennings and Charlotte. For the rest of his character and habits, they were marked, as far as Eleanor could perceive, with no trait at all unusual in his sex and time of life. He was nice in his eating, uncertain in his hours, fond of his child, though affecting to slight it, and idled away the mornings at billiards, which ought to have been devoted to business. She liked him, however, upon the whole, much better than she had expected, and in her heart was not sorry that she could like him no more, not sorry to be driven by the observation of his epicurism, his selfishness, and his conceit, to rest with complacency on the remembrance of Edward's generous temper, simple taste, and diffident feelings. Of Edward, or at least of some of his concerns, she now received intelligence from Colonel Brandon, who had been into Dorsetshire lately, and who, treating her at once as the disinterested friend of Mr. Ferrars and the kind confidant of himself, talked to her a great deal of the parsonage of Deltaford, described its deficiencies, and told her what he meant to do himself towards removing them. His behaviour to her in this, as well as in every other particular, his open pleasure in meeting her after an absence of only 10 days, his readiness to converse with her, and his deference for her opinion, might very well justify Mrs. Jennings's persuasion of his attachment, and would have been enough, perhaps, had not Eleanor still, as from the first, believed Marianne his real favourite. To make her suspect it herself, to make her suspect it herself. But as it was, such a notion had scarcely ever entered her head except by Mrs. Jennings's suggestion, and she could not help believing herself the nicest observer of the two. She watched his eyes while Mrs. Jennings thought only of his behaviour, and while his looks of anxious solicitude on Marianne's feeling. In her head and throat the beginning of a heavy cold, because unexpressed by words, entirely escaped the latter lady's observation. She could discover in them the quick feelings and needless alarm of a lover. Two delightful twilight walks on the third and fourth evenings of her being there, not merely on the dry gravel of the shrubbery, but all over the grounds, and especially in the most distant parts of them, where there was something more of wildness than in the rest, where the trees were the oldest and the grass was the longest and wettest, and assisted by the still greater imprudence of sitting in her wet shoes and stockings, given Marianne a cold so violent as, though for a day or two trifled with or denied, would force itself by increasing ailments on the concern of everybody and the notice of herself. Prescriptions poured in from all quarters, and as usual were all declined. Though heavy and feverish, with a pain in her limbs, a cough, and a sore throat, a good night's rest was to cure her entirely, and it was with difficulty that Eleanor prevailed on her when she went to bed to try one or two of the simplest of the remedies. End of chapter 42. Poor Marianne. Best girl is sick. 43. Marianne got up the next morning at her usual time. To every inquiry replied that she was better, and tried to prove herself so by engaging in her customary employments. But a day spent in sitting shivering over the fire with a book in her hand, which she was unable to read, or in lying weary and languid on a sofa, did not much speak in favor of her amendment. And when at last she went to bed early, more and more indisposed, Colonel Brandon was only astonished at her sister's composure, who, though attending and nursing her the whole day against Marianne's inclination, and forcing proper medicines on her at night, trusted, like Marianne, the certainty and efficacy of sleep, and felt no real alarm. A very restless and feverish night, however, disappointed the expectation of both, and when Marianne, after persisting in rising, confessed herself unable to sit up, and returned voluntarily to her bed, Eleanor was very ready to adopt Mrs. Jennings's advice of sending for the Palmer's apothecary. He came, examined his patient, and though encouraging Miss Dashwood to expect that a very few days would restore her sister to health, yet by pronouncing her disorder to a putrid tendency, and allowing the word infection to pass his lips, gave instant alarm to Mrs. Palmer, on her baby's account. Mrs. Jennings, who had been inclined from that first to think Marianne's complaint more serious than Eleanor, now looked very grave on Mr. Harris's report, and confirming Charlotte's fears and caution, urged the necessity of her immediate removal with her infant. And Mr. Palmer, though treating their apprehensions as idle, found the anxiety and importunity of his wife too great to be withstood. Her departure therefore was fixed on, and within an hour after Mr. Harris's arrival she set off with her little boy and his nurse for the house of a near relation of Mr. Palmer's, who lived a few miles on the other side of Bath, whither her husband promised, at her earliest entreaty, to join her in a day or two, at her earnest entreaty, to join her in a day or two, and whither she was almost equally urgent with her mother to accompany her. Mrs. Jennings, however, with a kindness of heart which made Eleanor really love her, declared her resolution of not stirring from Cleveland as long as Mary Ann remained ill, and of endeavoring by her own attentive care to supply to her the place of the mother she had taken her from. And Eleanor found her on every occasion a most willing and active helpmate, desirous to share in all her fatigues, and often by her better experience in nursing, of material use. Poor Marianne, languid and low from the nature of her malady, and feeling herself universally ill, could no longer hope that tomorrow would find her recovered, and the idea of what tomorrow would have produced but for this unlucky illness made every ailment more severe. For on that day they were to have begun their journey home, and attended the whole way by a servant of Mrs. Jennings, were to have taken their mother by surprise on the following forenoon. The little that she said was all in lamentation of this inevitable delay, though Eleanor tried to raise her spirits and make her believe, as she then really believed herself, that it would be a very short one. The next day produced little or no alteration in the state of the patient, She certainly was not better, and except that there was no amendment, did not appear worse. Their party was now further reduced, for Mr. Palmer, though very unwilling to go, as well as from real humanity and good nature as from a dislike of appearing to be frightened away by his wife, was persuaded at last by Colonel Brandon to perform his promise of following her. And while he was preparing to go, Colonel Brandon himself, with a much greater exertion, began to talk of going likewise. Here, however, the kindness of Mrs. Jennings interposed most acceptably, for to send the Colonel away while his love was in so much uneasiness on her sister's account would be to deprive them both, she thought, of every comfort, and therefore telling him at once that his stay at Cleveland was necessary to herself, that she should want him to play a piquet of an evening while Miss Dashwood was above with her sister, etc. She urged him so strongly to remain that he, who was gratifying the first wish of his own heart by a compliance, could not long even affect to demur, especially at Mrs. Jennings' entreaty, was warmly seconded by Mr. Palmer, who seemed to feel a relief to himself in leaving behind a person so well able to assist or advise Miss Dashwood in an emergency. Marianne was of course kept in ignorance of all these arrangements. She knew not that she had been the means of sending the owners of Cleveland away in about 7 days from the time of their arrival. It gave her no surprise that she saw nothing of Mrs. Palmer, and it gave her likewise no concern. She never mentioned her name. 2 days passed from the time of Mr. Palmer's departure, and her situation continued, with little variation, the same, the same. Mr. Harris, who attended her every day, still talked boldly of a speedy recovery, and Miss Dashwood was equally sanguine. Excuse me. But the expectation of the others was by no means so cheerful. Mrs. Jennings had determined very early in the seizure that Mary Ann would never get over it, and Colonel Brandon, who was chiefly of use in listening to Mrs. Jennings' forebodings, was not in a state of mind to resist their influence. He tried to reason himself out of fears, which the different judgment of the apothecary seemed to render absurd. But the many hours of each day in which he was left entirely alone were but too favorable for the admission of every melancholy idea, and he could not expel from his mind the persuasion that he should see Marianne no more. On the morning of the third day, however, the gloomy anticipation of both were almost done away, for when Mr. Harris arrived, he declared his patient materially better. Her pulse was much stronger, and every symptom more favorable than on the preceding visit. Eleanor, confirmed in every pleasant hope, was all cheerfulness, rejoicing that in her letters to her mother she had pursued her own judgment rather than her friends, in making very light of the indisposition which delayed them at Cleveland, and almost fixing on the time when Mary Ann would be able to travel. But the day did not close so auspiciously as it began. Towards the evening Mary Ann became ill again, growing more heavy, restless, and uncomfortable than before. Her sister, however, still sanguine, was willing to attribute the change to nothing more than the fatigue of having sat up to have her bed made, and carefully administering the cordials prescribed, saw her with satisfaction sink at last into a slumber from which she expected the most beneficial effects. Her sleep, though not so quiet as Eleanor wished to see it, lasted a considerable time, and anxious to observe the result of it herself, she resolved to sit with her during the whole of it. Mrs. Jennings, knowing nothing of any change in the patient, went unusually early to bed. Her maid, who was one of the principal nurses, was recreating herself in the housekeeper's room, and Eleanor remained alone with Marianne. The repose of the latter became more and more disturbed, and her sister, who watched with remitting attention her continual change of posture, and heard the frequent but inarticulate sounds of complaint which passed her lips, was almost wishing to rouse her from so painful a slumber. When Marianne, suddenly awakened by some accidental noise in the house, started hastily up, and with feverish wildness cried out, "Is mamma coming?" "Not yet," replied the other, concealing her terror, and assisting Marianne to lie down again. "But she will be here, I hope, before it is long. It is a great way, you know, from hence to Barton." "But she must not go round by London," cried Marianne in the same hurried manner. "I shall never see her if she goes round by London." Eleanor perceived with alarm that she was not quite herself, and while attempting to soothe her, eagerly felt her pulse. It was lowering. It was lower and quicker than ever, and Marianne still talking wildly of mamma, her alarm increased so rapidly as to determine her on sending instantly for Mr. Harris and dispatching a messenger to Barton for her mother. To consult with Colonel Brandon on the best means of effecting the latter was a thought which immediately followed the resolution of its performance. And as soon as she had rung up the maid to take her place by her sister, she hastened down to the drawing room, where she knew he was generally to be found at a much later hour than the present. It was no time for hesitation. Her fears and her difficulties were immediately before him. Her fears he had no courage, no confidence to attempt the removal of. He listened to them in silent despondence. But her difficulties were instantly obviated, for with a readiness that seemed to speak the occasion, and the service prearranged in his mind, he offered himself as the messenger who should fetch Mrs. Dashwood. Eleanor made no resistance that was not easily overcome. She thanked him with brief though fervent gratitude, and while he went to hurry off his servant with a message to Mr. Harris and an order for post horses directly, she wrote a few lines to her mother. The comfort of such a friend at that moment as Colonel Brandon was such a sorry, of such a companion for her mother. How gratefully it was felt! A companion whose judgment would guide, whose attendance must relieve, and whose friendship might soothe her. As far as the shock of such a summons could be lessened to her, her presence, his presence, his manners, his assistance would lessen it. He, meanwhile, whatever he might feel, acted with all the firmness of a collected mind, made every necessary arrangement with the utmost dispatch, and calculated with exactness the time in which she might look for his return. Not a moment was lost in delay of any kind. The horses arrived even before they were expected, and Colonel Brandon, only pressing her hand with a look of solemnity and a few words spoken too low to reach her ear, hurried into the carriage. It was then about 12 o'clock, and she returned to her sister's apartment to wait for the arrival of the apothecary and to watch by her the rest of the night. It was a night of almost equal suffering to both. Hour after hour passed away in sleepless pain and delirium on Marianne's side, and in the most cruel anxiety on Eleanor's. Before Mr. Harris appeared, her apprehensions once raised paid by their excess for all her former security, and the servant who sat up with her, for she would not allow Mrs. Jennings to be called, only tortured her more by hints of what her mistress had always thought. Marianne's ideas were still, at intervals, fixed incoherently on her mother, and whenever she mentioned her name, it gave a pang to the heart of poor Eleanor. who, reproaching herself for having trifled with so many days of illness, and wretched for some immediate relief, fancied that all relief might soon be in vain, that everything had been delayed too long, and pictured to herself her suffering mother arriving too late to see this darling child, or to see her rational. She was on the point of sending again for Mr. Harris, or if he could not come, for some other advice, when the former, but not till after 5 o'clock, arrived. His opinion, however, made some little amends for his delay, for though acknowledged a very unexpected and unpleasant alteration in his patient, he would not allow the danger to be material, and talked of the relief with a fresh mode of treatment must procure. With a confidence which, in a lesser degree, was communicated to Eleanor, he promised to call again in the course of 3 or 4 hours, and left the patient and her anxious attendant more composed than he had found them. With strong concern, and with many reproaches for not being called to their aid, did Mrs. Jennings hear in the morning of what had passed. Her former apprehensions, now with greater reason restored, left her no doubt of the event, and though trying to speak comfort to Eleanor, her conviction of her sister's danger would not allow her to offer the comfort of hope. Her heart was really grieved. The rapid decay, the early death of a girl so young, so lovely as Marianne, must have struck a less interested person with concern. On Miss Jennings' compassion she had other claims. She had been for 3 months her companion, was still under her care, and she was known to have been greatly injured and long unhappy. The distress of her sister, too, particularly a favourite, was before her. And as for their mother, when Mrs. Jennings considered that Marianne might probably be to her what Charlotte was to herself, her sympathy in her suffering was very sincere. Mr. Harris was punctual in his second visit, but he came to be disappointed in in his hopes of what the last would produce. His medicines had failed. The fever was unabated, and Marianne, only more quiet, not more herself, remained in an heavy stupor. Eleanor, catching all, and more than all, his fears in a moment, proposed to call in further advice, but he judged it unnecessary. He had still something more to try, some fresh application, of whose success he was almost as confident as the last, and his visit concluded with encouraging assurances which reached the ear but could not enter the heart of Miss Dashwood. She was calm except when she thought of her mother. But she was almost hopeless, and in this state she continued till noon, scarcely stirring from her sister's bed, her thoughts wandering from one image of grief, one suffering friend to another, and her spirits oppressed to the utmost by the conversation of Mrs. Jennings, who scrupled not to attribute the severity and danger of this attack, the many weeks of previous indisposition which Marianne's disappointment had brought on. Eleanor felt all this reasonableness of the idea, and gave it fresh misery to her reflections. About noon, however, she began, but with a caution, a dread of disappointment, which for some time kept her silent even to her friend, to fancy, to hope, she could perceive a slight amendment in her sister's pulse. She waited, watched, and examined it again and again, and at last, with an agitation more difficult to bury under exterior calmness than all her foregoing distress, ventured to communicate her hopes. Mrs. Jennings, though forced on examination to acknowledge a temporary revival, tried to keep her young friend from indulging a thought of its continuance, and Eleanor, conning over every injunction of distrust, told herself likewise not to hope. But it was too late. Hope had already entered, and feeling all its anxious flutter, she bent over her sister to watch. She hardly knew for what. Half an hour passed away, and the favorable symptom yet blessed her. Others even arose to confirm it. Her breath, her skin, her lips, all flattered Eleanor with signs of amendment, and Marianne fixed her eyes on her with a rational, though languid, gaze. Anxiety and hope now oppressed her in equal degrees, and left her no moment of tranquillity till the arrival of Mr. Harris at 4 o'clock, when his assurances, his felicitations on a recovery in her sister, even surpassing his expectation, gave her confidence, comfort, and tears of joy. Marianne was in every respect materially better, and he declared her entirely out of danger. Mrs. Jennings, perhaps satisfied with the partial justification of her forebodings, which had been found in their late alarm, allowed herself to trust in his judgment, and admitted with unfeigned joy, as soon as with unequivocal cheerfulness, the probability of an entire recovery. Eleanor could not be cheerful. Her joy was of a different kind, and led to anything rather than to gaiety. Marianne, restored to life, health, friends, and to her doting mother, was an idea to fill her heart with sensations of exquisite comfort and expand it in fervent gratitude. But it led to no outward demonstrations of joy, no words, no smiles. All within Eleanor's breast was satisfaction, silent and strong. She continued by the side of her sister with little intermission the whole afternoon, calming every fear, satisfying every inquiry of her enfeebled spirits, supplying every succor, and watching almost every look and every breath. The possibility of a relapse would, of course, in some moments occur to remind her of what anxiety was, but when she saw on her frequent and minute examinations that every symptom of recovery continued, saw Marianne at 6 o'clock sink into a quiet, steady, and to all appearance comfortable sleep, she silenced every doubt. The time was now drawing on when Colonel Brandon might be expected back. At 10 o'clock, she trusted, or at least not much later, her mother would be relieved from the dreadful suspense in which she would now be travelling toward them. Colonel, too, perhaps scarcely less an object of pity. Oh, how slow was the progress of time, which yet kept them in ignorance. At 7 o'clock, leaving Marianne still sweetly asleep, she joined Mrs. Jennings in the drawing room to tea. Of breakfast she had been kept by her fears, and of dinner by their sudden reverse, from eating much. And the present refreshment, therefore, with such feelings of content as she brought to it, was particularly welcome. Mrs. Jennings would have persuaded her at its conclusion to take some rest before her mother's arrival, and allow her to take her place by Marianne. But Eleanor had no sense of fatigue, no capability of sleep at that moment about her, and she was not to be kept away from her sister an unnecessary instant. Mrs. Jennings, therefore, attending her upstairs into that sick chamber to satisfy herself that all continued all right, left her there again to be to her charge and her thoughts, and retired to her own room to write letters and sleep. The night was cold and stormy. The wind roared around the house, and the rain beat against the windows, but Eleanor, all happiness within, regarded it not. Marianne slept through every blast, and the travellers, they had a rich reward in store for every present inconvenience. The clock struck 8. Had it been 10, Eleanor would have been convinced that at that moment she heard a carriage driving up to the house, and so strong was the persuasion that she did. In spite of the almost impossibility of their being already come, she moved into the adjoining dressing closet and opened a window shutter to be satisfied of the truth. She instantly saw that her ears had not deceived her. The flaring lamps of a carriage were immediately in view. By their uncertain light she thought she could discern it to be drawn by 4 horses, and this, while it told the excess of her poor mother's alarm, gave some explanation to such unexpected rapidity. Never in her life had Eleanor found it so difficult to be calm as at that moment. The knowledge of what her mother must be feeling as the carriage stopped at the door, of her doubt, her dread, perhaps her despair, and of what she had come to and of what she had to tell. With such knowledge it was impossible to be calm. All that remained to be done was to be speedy, and therefore, staying only till she could leave Mrs. Jennings' maid with her sister, she hurried downstairs. The bustle in the vestibule as she passed along an inner lobby assured her that they were already in the house. She rushed forward toward the drawing room. She entered it and saw only Willoughby. Willoughby! Oh man, what a what a what the heck? Willoughby's there. Who likes Willoughby? Not me. Not anybody I know. No, no, sir. I need some water. I'll be right back, but I think I'm going to keep reading. Whoa! I mean, that's some pretty harsh language, but I got to agree. Willoughby, I don't know why you'd want to do that to Willoughby, actually. He seems like the kind of guy who you wouldn't want to shack up with. That he betrays you. What's he even doing here, man? What's he even doing here? Why did he show up? I can't stand that he just showed up. That actually makes me really mad. But I gotta go get some water. I'll be right back. I'm back. I can't believe Willoughby just showed up. Let's see what he wants. Chapter 44. Eleanor, starting back with a look of horror at the sight of him, obeyed the first impulse of her heart in turning instantly to quit the room. Excuse me. And her hand was already on the lock when its action was suspended by his hastily advancing and saying in a voice rather of command than supplication, "Miss Dashwood, for half an hour, for 10 minutes, I entreat you to stay." "No, sir," she replied with firmness, "I shall not stay. Your business cannot be with me. The servants, I suppose, forgot to tell you that Mr. Palmer was not in the house." "Had they told me," he cried with vehemence, "that Mr. Palmer and all his relations were at the devil, it would not have turned me from the door. My business is with you, and only you." "With me?" in the utmost amazement. "Well, sir, be quick, and if you can, less violent. Sit down, and I will be both." She hesitated. She knew not what to do. The possibility of Colonel Brandon's arriving and finding him there across her. She had promised to hear him, and her curiosity no less than her honor was engaged. After a moment's recollection, therefore, concluding the prudence required dispatch, and that her acquaintance would best promote it, she walked silently towards the table and sat down. She took the opposite chair, and for half a minute not a word was said by either. "Pray be quick, sir," said Eleanor impatiently. "I have no time to spare." He was sitting in an attitude of deep meditation, and seemed not to hear her. "Your sister," said he with abruptness, a moment afterwards, "is out of danger? I heard it from the servant. God be praised! But is it true? Is it really true?" Eleanor would not speak. He repeated the inquiry with yet greater eagerness. "For God's sake, tell me, is she out of danger, or is she not?" "We hope she is." He rose and walked across the room. "Had I known as much half an hour ago! But since I am here," speaking with a forced vivacity as he returned to his seat, "what does it signify? For once, Miss Dashwood, it will be the last time, perhaps. Let us be cheerful together. I am in a fine mood for gaiety. Tell me honestly," a deeper glow overspreading his cheeks, "do you think me a most knave or a fool?" "Do you think me most a knave or a fool?" Eleanor looked at him with greater astonishment than ever. She began to think that he must be in liquor. The strangeness of such a visit and of such manners seemed no otherwise intelligible, and with this impression she immediately rose, saying, "Mr. Willoughby, I advise you at present to return to Combe. I am not at leisure to remain with you longer. Whatever your business may be with me, it will be better recollected and explained tomorrow." "I understand you," he replied with an expressive smile, and a voice perfectly calm. "Yes, I am very drunk. A pint of porter with my cold beef at Marlborough was enough to overset me." "Marlborough!" cried Eleanor, more and more at a loss to understand what he would be at. "Yes, I left London this morning at 8 o'clock, and only 10 minutes have I spent out of my chaise since the time procured me a luncheon at Marlborough." The steadiness of his manner and the intelligence of his eye spoke as he spoke, convincing Eleanor that whatever other unpardonable folly might bring him to Cleveland, it was not brought there by intoxication. She said, after a moment's recollection, "Mr. Willoughby, you ought to feel, and I certainly do, that after what has passed, your coming here in this manner and forcing yourself upon my notice requires a very particular excuse. What is it you mean by it?" Morgan Olivia 47 says, "I love Cleveland." Well, I think this is a different Cleveland than the one you're thinking of. You're thinking of Cleveland Brown from Family Guy. Yeah, I like him too. I like when he goes, "Oh no, 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 no." "I mean," said he with serious energy, "if I can, to make you hate me 1 degree less than you do now, I mean to offer some kind of explanation, some kind of apology for the past. To open my whole heart to you, and by convincing you that though I have been always a blockhead, I have not been always a rascal. To obtain something like forgiveness from your sister. Is this the real reason of your coming?" "Upon my soul it is," was his answer, with a warmth which brought all the former Willoughby to her remembrance, and in spite of herself, made her think him sincere. "If that is all, you may be satisfied already, for Marianne does. She has long forgiven you." "Has she?" he cried in the same eager tone. "Then she has forgiven me before she ought to have done it, but she shall forgive me again, and on more reasonable grounds. Now, will you listen to me?" Eleanor bowed her assent. "I do not know," said he, after a long pause of expectation on her side, and thoughtfulness on his own. How you may have accounted for my behavior to your sister, or what diabolical motive you may have imputed on me. Perhaps you will hardly think the better of me. It is worth the trial, however, and you shall hear everything. When I first became intimate in your family, I had no other intention, no other view in the acquaintance than to pass my time pleasantly while I was obliged to remain in Devonshire, more pleasantly than I had ever done before. Your sister's lovely person and interesting manners could not but please me, and her behavior to me almost from the first was of a kind. It is astonishing, when I reflect on what she was and what it was and what she was, that my heart should have been so insensible. But at first I must confess my vanity was only elevated by it. My vanity only was elevated by it. Carelessness of her happiness, thinking only of my own amusement, giving way to feelings which I had always been too much in the habit of indulging, I endeavored by every means in my power to make myself pleasing to her without any design of returning her affection. Miss Dashwood, at this point, turning her eyes on him with the most angry contempt, stopped him by saying, "It is hardly worth while, Mr. Willoughby, for you to relate, or for me to listen any longer." She was beginning as this cannot be followed by anything. "Do not let me be pained by hearing anything more on the subject." Sorry, such a beginning as this cannot be followed by anything. Do not let me be pained by hearing anything more on the subject. Hey, Dr. Dangles, welcome. I'm going to try to finish this today. "I insist on your hearing the whole of it," he replied. "My fortune was never large, and I had always been expensive, always in the habit of associating with people of better income than myself. Every year since my coming of age, or even before, I believe, had added to my debts, and though the death of my old cousin Mrs. Smith was to set me free, yet that event being uncertain and possibly far distant, it had been for some time my intention to re-establish my circumstances by marrying a woman of fortune. To attach myself to your sister, therefore, was not a thing to be thought of, and with a meanness, selfishness, cruelty, which no indignant, no contemptuous look, even of yours, Miss Dashwood, can ever reprobate too much. I was acting in this manner, trying to engage her regard without a thought of returning it. But one thing may be said for me, even in that horrid state of selfish vanity, I did not know the extent of the injury I meditated, because I did not then know what it was to love. But have I ever known it? Well, may it be doubted, for had I really loved, could I have sacrificed my feelings to vanity, to avarice, or what is more, could I have sacrificed hers? I have done it, to avoid a comparative poverty which her affection and her society would have deprived of all its horrors. I have, by raising myself to affluence, lost everything that could make it a blessing. "You did, then," said Eleanor, a little softened, "believe yourself at one time attached to her? To have resisted such attractions, to have withstood such tenderness, is there a man on earth who could have done it? Yes, I found myself, by insensible degrees, sincerely fond of her, and the happiest hours of my life were what I spent with her when I felt my intentions were strictly honorable and my feelings blameless. Even then, however, when fully determined on paying my address to her, I allowed myself most improperly to put off from day to day the moment of doing it, from an unwillingness to enter into an engagement while my circumstances were so greatly embarrassed. I will not return here, nor will I stop from you to expatiate on the absurdity, and the worse than absurdity, of scrupulating to engage my faith where my honor was already bound. The event had proved that it was a sorry. The event had proved that I was a cunning fool, providing the great circumspection for a possible opportunity of making myself contemptible and wretched forever. At last, however, my resolution was taken, and I had determined as soon as I could engage her alone to justify the attentions I had so invariably paid her, and openly assure her of an affection which I had already taken such pains to display. But in the interim of the very few hours that were to pass before I could have an opportunity of speaking with her in private, a circumstance occurred, an unlucky circumstance, to ruin all my resolution, and with it all my comfort. A discovery took place. Here he hesitated, and looked down. Mrs. Smith had somehow or other been informed, I imagine by some distant relation whose interest it was to deprive me of her favour, of an affair, a connection, but I need not explain myself further. He added, looking at her with a heightened colour and an inquiring eye. Your particular intimacy, you have probably heard the whole story long ago. I have, returned Eleanor, colouring likewise, and hardening her heart anew against any compassion for him. I have heard it all. How you will explain away any part of your guilt in that dreadful business, I confess is beyond my comprehension. Remember, cried Willoughby, from whom you received the account. Could it be an impartial one? I acknowledge that her situation and her character ought to have been respected by me. I do not mean to justify myself, but at the same time cannot leave you to suppose that I have nothing to urge. Because she was injured, she was uh, that because she was injured, she was irreproachable, and because I was a libertine, she must be a saint. If the violence of her passions, the weakness of her understanding, I do not mean, however, to defend myself, her affection for me deserved better treatment, and I often, with great self-reproach, recall the tenderness which for a very short time had the power of creating any return. I wish, I heartily wish it had never been. But I have injured more than herself, and I have injured one whose affection for me, may I say it, was scarcely less warm than hers, and whose mind, oh, how infinitely superior. I agree, Mary Ann does have a very beautiful mind. But the one he's talking about, I believe, is Colonel Brandon's sister, who he had impregnated on a fling. In case you needed some catching up. Oops. Sorry if that was loud. I knocked the microphone with the cup. Your indifference, however, towards that unfortunate girl, I must say it, unpleasant to me as the discussion of such a subject may well be, your indifference is no apology for your cruel neglect of her. Do not think yourself excused by any weakness, any natural defect of understanding on her side, in the wanton cruelty so evident on yours. You must have known that while you were enjoying yourself in Devonshire, pursuing fresh schemes, always gay, always happy, she was reduced to the extremest indi- indignance. But upon my soul I did not know it, he warmly replied. I did not recollect that I had omitted to give her my direction, and common sense might have told her how to find it out. Well, sir, and what said Mrs. Smith? She taxed me with the offence at once, and my confusion may be guessed. The purity of her life, the formality of her notions, her ignorance of the world, everything was against me. The matter itself I could not deny, and vain was every endeavour to soften it. She was previously disposed, I believe, to doubt the morality of my conduct in general, and was moreover discontented in the very little attention the very little portion of my time that I had bestowed on her in my present visit. In short, it ended in a total breach. By one measure, I might have saved myself. In the height of her morality, good woman, she offered to forgive the past if I would marry Eliza. That could not be, and I was formally dismissed from her favor and her house. The night following this affair, I was to go the next morning, and I was to go the next morning, was spent by me in deliberating on what my future conduct should be. The struggle was great, but it ended too soon. My affection for Marianne, my thorough conviction of her attachment to me, it was all insufficient to outweigh that dread of poverty, or get the better of those false ideas of the necessity of riches, which I was naturally inclined to feel, and expensive society had increased. I had reason to believe myself secure of my present wife if I had chose to address her, and I persuaded myself to think of nothing else in common prudence remained for me to do. A heavy scene, however, awaited me before I could leave Devonshire. I was engaged to dine with you on that very day. Some apology was therefore necessary for my breaking the engagement, but whether I should write this apology or deliver it in person was a point of long debate. To see Marianne, I felt, would be dreadful, and I even doubted whether I could see her again and keep my resolution. In that point, however, I undervalued my own magnanimity, as the event declared, for I saw her, and saw her miserable, and left her miserable, and left her hoping never to see her again. "Why did you call, Mr. Willoughby?" said Eleanor reproachfully. "A note would have answered every purpose. Why was it necessary to call?" "It was necessary to my own pride. I could not bear to leave the country in a matter that might lead you, or the rest of the neighborhood, to suspect any part of what had really passed between Mrs. Smith and myself, and I resolved, therefore, on calling at the cottage in my way to Honiton. The sight of your dear sister, however, was really dreadful, and to heighten the manner I found her alone. While you were all gone, I did not know where. I had left her only the evening before, so fully, so firmly resolved within myself on doing right. Few hours were to have engaged her to me forever, and I remember how happy, how gay were my spirits as I walked from the cottage to Allenham, satisfied with myself, delighted with everybody. But in this, our last interview of friendship, I approached her with a sense of guilt almost took from me the power of dissembling. Her sorrow, her disappointment, her deep regret when I told her that I was obliged to leave Devonshire so immediately, I shall never forget it. United, too, with such reliance, such confidence in me. Oh God, what a hard-hearted rascal I was! They were both silent for a few moments. Eleanor spoke first. "Did you tell her that you should soon return?" "I do not know what I told her," he replied impatiently. "Less than was due to the past, beyond a doubt, and in all likelihood much more than was justified by the future. I cannot think of it. It won't do. Then came your dear mother to torture me further with all her kindness and confidence. Thank heaven, it did torture me. I was miserable. Miss Dashwood, you cannot have any idea of the comfort it gives me to look back on my own misery. I owe such a grudge to myself for the stupid, rascally folly of my own heart, that all my past sufferings under it are only triumph and exaltation to me now. Well, I went, left after all that I loved, and went to those to whom at best I was only indifferent. My journey to town, travelling with my own horses, and therefore so tediously, no creature to speak to, my own reflections so cheerful, when I looked forward everything so inviting. and I looked back at Barton, the picture so soothing. Oh, it was a blessed journey. He stopped. Well, sir, said Eleanor, who, though pitying him, grew impatient for his departure. And this is all? All! No, have you forgot what passed in town? That infamous letter? Did she show it to you? Yes, I saw every note that passed. When the first of hers reached me, as it immediately did, for I was in town the whole time, what I felt is, in the common phrase, not to be expressed. In a more simple one, perhaps too simple to raise any emotion, my feelings were very, very painful. Every line, every word in the hackneyed metaphor which their dear writer, were she here, would forbid, a dagger to my heart. To know that Marianne was in town. Well, to know that Marianne was in town was, in the same language, a thunderbolt. Thunderbolts and daggers! What a reproof would she have given me! Her taste, her opinions, I believe they are better known to me than my own, and I am sure they are dearer. Eleanor's heart, which had undergone many changes in the course of this extraordinary conversation, was now softened again. Yet she felt it her duty to check such ideas in her companion as the last. This is not right, Mr. Willoughby. Remember that you are married. Relate only what in your conscience you think necessary for me to hear. Marianne's note, by assuring me that I still as dear to her as in former days, that in spirit sorry, that in spite of the many, many weeks we had been separated, she was as constant in her own feelings as and as full of faith in the consistency of mine as ever, awakened all my remorse. I say awakened because time and London, business and dissipation, had in some measure quieted it, and I had been growing a fine hardened villain, fancying myself indifferent to her, and choosing to fancy that she, too, must have become indifferent to me, talking to myself of our past attachment as a mere idle, trifling business, shrugging up my shoulders in proof of it being so, and silencing every reproach, overcoming every scruple, by secretly saying now and then, I shall be heartily glad to hear she is she is well married. But this note made me know myself better. I felt that she was infinitely dearer to me than any other woman in the world, and that I was using her infamously. But everything was then just settled between Miss Grey and me. To retreat was impossible. All that I had to do was to avoid you both. I sent no answer to Marianne, intending by that means to preserve myself from her further notice, and for some time I was even determined not to call in Berkeley Street, but at last, judging it wiser to affect the air of a cool, common acquaintance than anything else, I watched you all safely out of the house one morning and left my name. Wow, he really is—he's doing the 1811 version of ghosting, if you know what ghosting is. He really is. He watched them leave and then left his note, just so he knew he wouldn't run into them. Watched us out of the house! Even so, you would be surprised to hear how often I watched you, how often I was on the point of falling in with you. I have entered many a shop to avoid your sight as the carriage drove by. Lodging as I did in Bond Street, there was hardly a day in which I did not catch a glimpse of one or other of you, and nothing but the most constant watchfulness on my side, the most invariable prevailing desire to keep out of your sight, could have separated us so long. I avoided the Middletons as much as possible, as well as everybody else who was likely to prove an acquaintance in common. Not aware of their being in town, however, I blundered on Sir John, I believe the first day of his coming, and the day after I had called at Mrs. Jennings. He asked me to a party, a dance at his house in the evening. It told me not Had he not told me as an inducement that you and your sister were to be there, I should have felt it too certain a thing to thrust myself near him. The next morning brought another short note from Mary Ann, still affectionate, open, artless, confiding, everything that could make my conduct most hateful. I could not answer it. I tried, but could not frame a sentence. I thought of her, I believe, every moment of the day. If you can pity me, Miss Dashwood, pity my situation as it was then. With my head and heart full of your sister, I was forced to play the happy lover to another woman. Those 3 or 4 weeks were worse than all. Well, at last, as I need not tell you, you were forced on me. And what a sweet figure I cut! What an evening of agony it was! Mary Ann, as beautiful as an angel on one side, calling me Willoughby in such a tone. Oh, God, holding out her hand to me, asking me for an explanation with those bewitching eyes fixed in such speaking solicitude on my face, and Sophia, jealous as the devil on the other hand, looking all that was, well, it does not signify, it is over now. Such an evening! I ran away from you all as soon as I could, but not before I had seen Mary Ann's sweet face as white as death. That was the last look I ever had of her, the last manner in which she approached me. It was a horrid sight. Yet when I thought of her today as really dying, it was a kind of comfort to me to imagine that I knew exactly how she would appear to those who saw her last in this world. She was before me, constantly before me as I travelled, in the same look and hue. A short pause of mutual thoughtfulness succeeded. Willoughby, first rousing himself, broke it thus: "Well, let me make haste and be gone. Your sister is certainly better, certainly out of danger. We are assured of it. Your poor mother, too, doting on Mary Ann. But the letter, Mr. Willoughby, your own letter. Have you anything to say about that?" "Yes, yes, that in particular. Your sister wrote to me again, you know, the very next morning. She saw what she said. You saw what she said. I was breakfasting at the Ellisons, and her letter, with some others, was brought to me there from my lodgings. It happened to catch Sophia's eye before it caught mine, and its size, the elegance of the paper, the handwriting altogether, immediately gave her a suspicion. Some vague report had reached her before of my attachment to some young lady in Devonshire, and what had passed within her observation the preceding evening had marked who the young lady was, and made her more jealous than ever. Affecting that air of playfulness, therefore, which is delightful in a woman who one loves, she opened the letter directly and read its contents. She was well paid for her impudence. She read what made her wretched. Her wretchedness I could have borne, but her passion, her malice, at all events it must be appeased. And in short, what do you think of my wife's style of letter writing? Delicate, tender, truly feminine, was it not?" "Your wife! The letter was in your own handwriting." "Yes, but I had only the credit of servilely copying such sentences as I was ashamed to put my name to. The original was all her own happy thoughts and gentle diction. But what could I do? We were engaged, everything in preparation, the day almost fixed. But I am talking like a fool. Preparation, day! In honest words, her money was necessary to me, and in a situation like mine, anything was to be done to prevent a rupture. And after all, what did it signify to my character and the opinion of Mary Ann and her friends in what language my answer was couched? It must have been only to one end. My business was to declare myself a scoundrel, and whether I did it with a bow or a bluster was of little importance. I am ruined forever in their opinion, said I to myself. I am shut out forever from their society. They already think me an unprincipled fellow. This letter will only make them think me a blackguard one. Such were my reasonings as, in a sort of desperate carelessness, I copied my wife's words and parted with the last relic of Marianne. Her 3 notes, unluckily, they were all in my pocket-book, or I should have denied their existence and hoarded them forever. I was forced to put them up, and could not even kiss them. And the lock of hair, that, too, I had always carried about me in the same pocket-book, which was now searched by Madame with the most ingratiating virulence. The dear lock, all, every memento, was torn from me. You are very wrong, Mr. Willoughby, very blamable, said Eleanor, while her voice, in spite of herself, betrayed her compassionate emotion. You ought not to speak in this way either of Mrs. Willoughby or my sister. You have made your own choice. It was not forced on you. Your wife has a claim to your politeness, to your respect, at least. She must be attached to you, or she would not have married you. To treat her with unkindness, to speak of her slightingly, is no atonement to Marianne, nor can I suppose it a relief to your own conscience. Do not talk to me of my wife, said he with a heavy sigh. She does not deserve your compassion. She knew I had no regard for her when we married. Well, married we were, and came down to Combe Magna to be happy, and afterwards returned to town to be gay. And now do you pity me, Miss Dashwood, or have I said all this to no purpose? Am I, be it only 1 degree, am I less guilty in your opinion than I was before? My intentions were not always wrong. Have I explained away any part of my guilt? Yes, you have certainly removed something, a little. You have proved yourself on the whole less faulty than I had believed you. You had proved your heart less wicked, much less wicked. But I hardly know the misery that you have inflicted. I hardly know what could have made it worse. Will you repeat to your sister when she is recovered what I have been telling you? Let me be a little lightened too in her opinion as well as in yours. You tell me that she has forgiven me already. Let me be able to fancy that a better knowledge of my heart, and of my present feelings, will draw from her a more spontaneous, more natural, more gentle, less dignified forgiveness. Tell her of my misery and my penitence. Tell her that my heart was never inconsistent to her, and, if you will, that at this moment she is dearer to me than ever. Excuse me. I really enjoy your reading, says Dr. Dangles. Thank you. I will tell her all that is necessary to what my comparative to what may comparatively be called your justification. But you have not explained to me the particular reason of your coming now, nor how you heard of her illness. Last night in Drury Lane. Drury Lane? Isn't that where the Muffin Man lives? Last night in Drury Lane lobby I ran against Sir John Middleton, and when he saw who I was for the first time these 2 months, he spoke to me. That he had cut me ever since my marriage I had seen without surprise or resentment. Now, however, his good-natured, honest, stupid soul, full of indignation against me and concern for your sister, could not resist the temptation of telling me what he knew ought to, though probably he did not think it would, vex me horribly. As bluntly as he could speak it, therefore, he told me that Marianne Dashwood was dying of a putrid fever at Cleveland. A letter that morning received from Mrs. Jennings declared her danger most imminent. The Palmers all gone off in a fright, etc. I was too much shocked to be able to pass myself off and insensible, even to the undiscerning Sir John. His heart was softened in seeing mine suffer, and so much of his ill will was done away that when we parted he almost shook me by the hand, while he reminded me of an old promise about a pointer puppy. When I felt on hearing that your sister was dying, and dying too, believed believing me the greatest villain upon the earth, scoring, hating me in her latest moments. For how could I tell what horrid projections might not have been imputed? One person I was sure would represent me as capable of anything. What I felt was dreadful. My resolution was soon made, and at 8 o'clock this morning I was in my carriage. Now you know all. Eleanor made no answer. Her thoughts were silently fixed on the irreparable injury which too early in independence and consequent habits of idleness, dissipation, and luxury had made in the mind, the character, the happiness of a man who, to every advantage of person and talent, united a disposition naturally open and honest, and a feeling affectionate temper. The world had made him extravagant and vain. Extravagance and vanity had made him cold hearted and selfish. Vanity, while seeking in its own guilty triumph at the expense of another, had involved him in a real attachment which extravagance, or at least its offspring, necessity, had required to be sacrificed. Each faulty propensity in leading him to evil had led him likewise to punishment. The attachment from which, against honor, against feeling, against every better interest he had outwardly torn himself, now, when no longer allowable, governed every thought, and the connection, for the sake of which he had, with little scruple, left her sister to misery, was likely to prove a source of unhappiness to himself of a far more incurable nature. From a reverie of this kind she was recalled at the end of some minutes by Willoughby, who, rousing himself from a reverie at least equally painful, started up in preparation for going, and said, "There is no use in staying here. I must be off." "Are you going back to town?" "No, to Combe Magna. I have business there. From thence to town in a day or two. Good-bye." He held out his hand. She could not refuse to give him hers. He pressed it with affection. "And you do think something better of me than you did?" said he, letting it fall, and leaning against the mantelpiece as if forgetting he was to go. Eleanor assured him that she did, that she forgave, pitied, wished him well, and even interested in his happiness, and added some gentle counsel as not to the behavior most likely to promote it. His answer was not very encouraging. "As to that," said he, "I must rub through the world as well as I can. Domestic happiness is out of the question. If, however, I am allowed to think that you and yours feel an interest in my fate and actions, it may be the means, it may put me on my guard, at least it will be something to live for. Marianne, to be sure, is lost to me forever, were I even by any blessed chance at liberty again." Eleanor stopped him with a reproof. "Well," he replied, "once more good-bye. I shall now go away and live in the dread of one event." "What do you mean?" "Your sister's marriage." "You are very wrong. She can never be more lost to you than she is now. But she will be gained by someone, and if that someone should be the very he whom of all others I could least bear, but I will not stay to rob myself of all your compassionate goodwill by showing that Where I have most injured, I can least forgive. Goodbye. God bless you. And with these words, he almost ran out of the room. Jeez, I've been going for an hour and a half, and I have, let's see, how many more? I have, oof, what is that? What is that? 331 minus 288 at 43 pages. Hmm. Perhaps I don't finish things tonight. 2.5 hours. Uh, it's already quite the long video there. I think that's another. Do you have any idea what your next book is going to be? Yeah, I was thinking I was gonna get a short one in, uh, with a couple of things. It's a beautiful day. Go outside. That's what I was thinking. I don't want to be cooped up here for another, hour or two, however long it takes to read another 43 pages. So I think I'll save that one for another day, probably tomorrow. Finishing off Sense and Sensibility very soon. I think the next book, I really want to get some H.G. Wells in because that was suggested on the YouTube page. Um, so I like War of the Worlds. I've already read it, is the thing. I've never read his other stuff, though, like The Time Machine is one that I was thinking about. I might just do them both. I like War of the Worlds a lot because I like the musical of War in the Worlds musical, whatever you want, the rock album based on it. But Time Machine, yeah, I think I'll go with Time Machine really first, if anything, and then maybe War of the Worlds if I'm still feeling some Wells. But yeah, I think the next thing that's going to be read is some H.G. Wells. Mix things up, get out of this. Get out of the romance and the low drama, the personal drama of uh, of this era. Jump about 100 years in the future and have some thrilling science fiction action. Sounds good. Thank you for everything you do. Hey, I just read books. It's just for fun. Well, everybody, if it's a nice day out where you are, get outside, enjoy the fresh air, and I'll see you next time. Most probably tomorrow evening. Um, God bless you all, and have a good Sunday.